The road felt longer than he remembered. Richard Hayes gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight. 8 years. 8 years since he'd driven this route. The real estate agent had asked why he never came back to check on the property. He didn't answer. The house appeared behind the old oak trees. He slowed the car, then stopped completely. The curtains were different. He sat there, engine running, staring at windows that used to be bare. White lace now. Flowers in the window box. The garden someone had planted tomatoes along the fence. His hand found the old key in his pocket. Still there. Always there. He cut the engine. The front door looked freshly painted, and from somewhere inside, he caught the faint smell of something cooking. Someone was living in his dead wife's house. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you reading from today? Drop your city or state below. As my grandmother used to say, a story shared is a story doubled. Richard pushed the door open. The hinges didn't creak. Someone had oiled them. The hallway smelled like garlic and rosemary. A coat hung on the hook by the door, small, child-sized, bright red. His throat tightened. He moved toward the kitchen. The floorboards groaned under his weight. A woman stood at the stove, her back to him. Dark hair pulled into a loose bun. Thin shoulders. A faded blue apron. His heart stopped. She turned. The spoon slipped from her fingers and clattered against the tile floor. Margaret, 8 years older. Lines around her eyes that weren't there before. But her face, that face. The same face he'd seen in every dream. Every sleepless night. Every bottle he'd emptied trying to forget. She didn't scream. Didn't run to him. Didn't cry. She just stood there, one hand gripping the counter, knuckles white. Richard. His name in her voice. After 8 years of silence. You're... The word caught in his chest. You're alive. She didn't answer. Her eyes moved to the hallway behind him, then back to his face. Something flickered there, not joy, not relief. Something that looked more like exhaustion, the kind that settles into bones after years of carrying weight alone. You shouldn't be here. The words hit him like ice water. Shouldn't be. He stepped forward. Margaret, I buried you. I stood at your grave. You need to leave. Her voice came out flat, distant, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized years ago. No. His hands shook. No, you don't get to. I thought you were dead. For 8 years, I thought, please. She held up one hand. Not now. Then when? When were you planning to tell me you weren't in that coffin? When? A sound from the hallway. Small footsteps. Soft. Careful. Richard turned. A boy stood in the doorway. 6, maybe 7 years old. Dark hair like Margaret's. But his eyes Richard's breath caught. The boy didn't cry. Didn't hide behind the doorframe. He stood perfectly still, watching Richard with an expression that seemed far too old for his face. And in those eyes, brown, flecked with gold, shaped exactly like the ones Richard saw every morning in the mirror, there was no confusion, only recognition, like he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life. The boy's eyes held him in place. Richard's mind raced, calculating. The child looked 6, maybe 7. Margaret had disappeared 8 years ago, which meant his stomach turned. She was already pregnant. Before the accident. Before the funeral. Before he'd spent 3 months unable to get out of bed. Pregnant with someone else's child. He turned back to Margaret. She hadn't moved from her spot by the stove. The burnt smell of whatever she'd been cooking filled the kitchen now, but neither of them reached to turn off the burner. Who is he? His voice came out rough, wrong, like it belonged to someone else. Margaret's hand tightened on the counter. Richard, please. Who is the father? She flinched. Actually flinched, like he'd struck her. Good. You let me think you were dead. Each word scraped against his throat. 8 years, 8 years I blamed myself. 8 years I wondered what I could have done differently. And this whole time, you were here, in our house. He gestured toward the boy without looking at him. With his child. It's not what you think. Then explain it. He stepped closer. The kitchen felt smaller now. The walls pressing in. Explain why you're standing in the house I bought for us, cooking dinner like nothing happened, while I've been... He stopped. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs. "I trusted you." The words tasted like ash. "I trusted you, and you were planning your escape the whole time. What was the plan? Wait until I was at work. Pack your bags. Run off with whoever he is." "There is no he. Don't lie to me." His voice echoed off the tile walls. The boy in the doorway didn't move, didn't cry, didn't run to his mother for protection. He just stood there, watching, those familiar eyes tracking every movement, every word. Something about that stillness made Richard's skin prickle. "You staged your own death." He forced himself to lower his voice. "You let them put an empty coffin in the ground. You let me stand there in the rain, reading your eulogy while you were what? Laughing. Celebrating your freedom." "I wasn't laughing." "Then what were you doing?" Margaret closed her eyes. Her shoulders rose and fell with a long breath. When she opened them again, something had shifted. The exhaustion was still there, but underneath it something harder, sharper. "I was surviving. Surviving what our marriage? Was it really that unbearable?" She didn't answer. Her gaze moved to the boy, then back to Richard. A silent conversation passed between mother and son, the kind that only comes from years of shared secrets. "You need to go." Her voice was steady now, controlled. "I'll explain everything, but not like this. Not with him here. Not with—" Richard laughed. It sounded wrong even to his own ears. "You mean your son, the child you had with another man while I was mourning you. He's not—" She stopped herself, pressed her lips together. "He's not what? Not yours, because I can see your face in his. Margaret, same nose, same chin, same way of standing with one foot turned slightly inward. So don't insult me by pretending—" "Leave, please!" The two words hung in the air between them. Quiet. Final. "No." Richard crossed his arms. The watch on his wrist caught the overhead light, the same watch he'd been wearing for 15 years. The same watch his father had given him the day he'd proposed to Margaret. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me the truth. All of it. Who is the boy's father? How did you fake your death? And why?" His voice cracked. He swallowed hard. "Why wasn't I enough?" Silence. The stove burner hissed. Smoke curled toward the ceiling. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping across the window. Margaret opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the boy's voice cut through the kitchen. "Mom!" Richard turned. The child had moved closer, 3 steps into the room, close enough now that Richard could see the faint scar on his chin, the grass stain on his knee, the way his small hands hung loose at his sides, not clenched, not trembling, just waiting. "Mom," the boy said again. His voice was calm and clear, too calm for a child watching his mother being yelled at by a stranger. "I'm okay." Something about the way he said it, not seeking comfort, giving it. A 7-year-old, reassuring his mother in the middle of a confrontation. Richard stared at the child, really looked at him for the first time. The dark hair, the shape of his jaw, the way he held himself straight-backed, chin slightly raised, the gold flecks in his brown eyes. Gold flecks, just like no, it wasn't possible. He turned away, headed for the door. He needed air, needed space, needed to think. His hand closed around the doorknob. "I know who you are." The boy's voice, I know, small but clear. Not a question. Not an accusation. A statement. Richard's fingers froze on the metal. He didn't turn around. Couldn't. "I know who you are," the boy repeated. "I've always known." The kitchen went silent. Even the stove seemed to stop hissing. Richard stood at the threshold, one hand on the door, the other pressed flat against the wall to keep himself upright. His heart hammered against his ribs. Behind him, Margaret's breath caught, and the boy who should have been crying, should have been hiding, should have been afraid of the angry stranger in his kitchen, simply waited, patient, certain, as if he'd been rehearsing this moment for years. Richard turned around. The boy stood 5 feet away, his small frame silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. He didn't look afraid, didn't look nervous. He looked like a child who had spent years preparing for a conversation he knew would eventually come. What did you say? Richard's voice came out hoarse. His hand still gripped the doorknob behind him. I know who you are. The boy's tone was matter of fact, simple, like he was stating that the sky was blue or that water was wet. I seen your picture. Richard glanced at Margaret. She stood frozen by the stove, her face pale, one hand pressed against her chest. What picture? The boy turned and walked toward the refrigerator. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He reached up and pointed to a drawing held in place by a magnet shaped like a ladybug. Richard moved closer. His legs felt unsteady beneath him. The drawing was done in crayon. A house with a red door, a woman with dark hair standing in front, and next to her, a tall figure, a man, brown hair, blue shirt, and on his wrist, a watch, drawn carefully, with more detail than anything else on the page. A silver circle, a band. Richard looked down at his own wrist. The same watch, the one his father gave him, the one he'd worn every day for 15 years. I drew that, the boy said. He stood beside Richard now, close enough that Richard could smell the laundry detergent on his clothes. Mom told me about you a long time ago, before she stopped. Richard's throat tightened. Your mother told you about me. Yeah, the boy's voice dropped, softer now. When I was little, she'd tell me stories about a man who was kind, who worked too much but always came home, who loved her. The words landed somewhere deep in Richard's chest. He couldn't speak. But then she stopped. The boy continued. He looked down at his shoes, scuffed sneakers, one lace untied. One day she just stopped. I asked her why, and she said some things are too heavy to carry every day. Richard looked at Margaret. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was watching the boy with something that looked almost like resignation. The picture, Richard managed. When did you draw it? 3 years ago. The boy paused, swallowed. After the park. The words didn't make sense. Richard shook his head. What park? The boy looked up at him. Those eyes, his eyes. Richard realized with a jolt held steady. The one on Oak Street, by the old library. He spoke slowly, like he was pulling each word from somewhere deep. You were sitting on a bench, by yourself. You looked sad. Richard's mind scrambled. Oak Street, the bench by the fountain. He used to go there sometimes, after the funeral, after the drinking got bad. He'd sit for hours watching people walk by, trying to remember what it felt like to be one of them. I was with Mom. The boy interrupted. His voice wavered now. Smaller. We were walking to the store. She saw you first. She stopped. She grabbed my hand really tight. And then she said, he paused, looked down at his feet again. That's him. Richard's legs threatened to give out. He reached for the counter, steadying himself. I didn't know what she meant, but I looked at you, and you looked back at me. Just for a second. The boy's voice had changed, younger now, the careful composure cracking at the edges. I got away from Mom. I ran to you. You were still sitting on the bench. I stopped right in front of you and I asked. He swallowed hard. I asked if you were my dad. The kitchen tilted. Richard gripped the counter harder. No, he whispered. No, I would have remembered that. I would have. You said no. The boy's voice cut through the air. Flat. Final. You said, sorry, kid, wrong person. And then you got up and walked away. Richard's chest seized. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room spun around him. I don't remember. You were wearing that watch. The boy pointed at Richard's wrist. The shiny one. I remembered it because it caught the sun when you stood up. It was the only shiny thing. Everything else about you was gray. Richard stared at the watch. The scratched crystal. The faded numbers. The band that had turned dull with age. He tried to remember that day. Tried to pull it up from the fog of those years. The drinking. The darkness. The way one day bled into the next until they all looked the same. A child's face, a question. A dismissal. Had it happened? Had he really sat on that bench, looked into his own son's eyes, and said, "No, I ran back to Mom"? The boy continued. His voice was trembling now. "She was crying. She picked me up and carried me the whole way. She didn't say anything. But that night—" He stopped, rubbed his nose with the back of his hand. "That night she held me for a long time. And she said, sometimes people can't see what's right in front of them." Richard's knees buckled. He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his head in his hands. "I don't understand." His voice broke. "Why didn't you come to the house? Why didn't you knock on the door? Why did you let me think?" "She tried." Margaret's voice, the first word she'd spoken since the boy started talking. Richard looked up. She stood in the same spot by the stove, but something had changed. Her shoulders had dropped. The tension in her jaw had eased. She looked tired, more tired than anyone should look. "I tried, Richard, before the park, when he was only 1 year old. I came to your door. I stood there for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage." His heart pounded in his chest. "What happened?" She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the last light of evening was fading. "You opened the curtain," she said finally. "You looked right at me. And then you closed it again." The words hung in the air. Richard stared at her, his mind racing backward. 1 year after the funeral, the worst of the drinking, the days when he could barely stand, barely function, barely a woman at the door, a face through the window, his mother's voice in his ear, the curtain falling back into place. He looked down at the watch on his wrist, then up at the crayon drawing on the refrigerator, and for the first time in 8 years, everything he thought he knew began to crack. The kitchen had grown darker. Richard sat at the table, his hands flat against the worn wood surface. Margaret had turned off the stove. The burnt smell still hung in the air, mixing with the fading scent of rosemary. The boy had been sent to his room. Richard could hear his footsteps above them, crossing the floor, then settling into silence. "Tell me everything." His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow, like someone had carved out the inside of him and left only the shell. Margaret pulled out the chair across from him. She didn't sit immediately. Her fingers traced the back of the chair, following the grain of the wood. "Where do you want me to start?" "The beginning. 8 years ago. Before the accident. Before the funeral. Before—" He stopped, swallowed. "Before I lost you." She sat down. The chair creaked under her weight. In the dim light from the window, her face looked older than he remembered. Deeper lines around her mouth. A tiredness that seemed to seep from her bones. "I was 2 months pregnant," she said. "The day I found out, I went to the house to tell you, but you weren't home. Your mother was." Richard's jaw tightened. "My mother. She answered the door. I told her the news. I thought—" Margaret paused, her hands clasped together on the table. "I thought she'd be happy. A grandchild. Finally." What did she say? Nothing. At first. She invited me in, made tea, asked me questions about how far along I was. Had I been to a doctor? Margaret's voice dropped. "Was I sure it was yours?" The words hit Richard like a slap. "She asked you that, very calmly, like she was asking about the weather. She said she'd seen me talking to the gardener, the way I smiled at the mailman, the times I came home late from work." Richard's stomach turned. "That's ridiculous. You never—" "I know." Margaret held up one hand. "I know." But she believed it. Or she wanted to believe it. Either way, the result was the same. She looked down at her hands. Her wedding ring was gone. Richard noticed, just a faint tan line where it used to be. "She offered me money, $50,000 to leave town and never come back. She said it would be better for everyone, that you were too focused on your career to handle a scandal, that if I really loved you, I would disappear." Richard's chest tightened. "You should have told me. You should have come to me directly." "I tried." The two words fell between them like stones. "I called you. That same afternoon, your phone went to voicemail. I called again and again. 17 times in 3 days. Richard," he remembered those days, The missed calls, the voicemails he'd deleted without listening. His mother's voice. She's been calling everyone, making a scene. You know how she gets when she wants attention. I didn't know, he said. The words felt weak, insufficient. I wrote you a letter. Margaret continued as if she hadn't heard him. 12 pages. Everything I wanted to say. Everything I couldn't say on a voicemail. I put it in the mailbox myself. Watch the postman take it. Richard shook his head slowly. I never got a letter. I know. The implication hung in the air. His mother, checking the mail every day, sorting through the envelopes before he got home. She came back a week later, Margaret said, to the motel where I was staying, a little place on Route 9. She'd found out where I was. I still don't know how. She paused, drew a breath. She told me if I didn't take the money and disappear, she would make my life impossible. She had lawyers, connections. She said she would tell everyone I was unstable, that I'd been having affairs, that I was trying to trap you with a baby that might not even be yours. Richard's hands curled into fists on the table. And then she told me what she was going to tell you. What? Margaret met his eyes. That I'd been in a car accident, visiting my aunt in Pennsylvania, that the car caught fire, that they couldn't recover anything. She said she'd handle the arrangements, the cremation, everything, so you wouldn't have to suffer through it. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer. She told me you'd be devastated, Margaret continued, but that you'd heal, that you'd move on, find someone more suitable, someone from the right family. Richard's throat closed. He remembered those days, his mother's hand on his shoulder, her voice, soft and steady. I've taken care of everything. Darling, you don't need to worry about any of the details. Just rest. And he had. He'd let her handle it all, the calls, the paperwork, the service at the church with the closed casket. Why didn't you go to the police? His voice cracked. Why didn't you tell someone? With what proof? Margaret's eyes were dry, but something in them had broken long ago. She was Eleanor Hayes, your mother, the woman who ran the charity galas and sat on the hospital board. Who would believe a waitress from the wrong side of town? She unclasped her hands, laid them flat on the table. I took the money, not because I wanted it, because I was scared, because I was pregnant and alone, and I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could come back later, after the baby was born, after things settled down. You did come back. Yes. Her voice softened. When Daniel was 1 year old, I'd been working double shifts at a diner 2 towns over, saving what I could. I drove all night to get here. Richard remembered that year, the fog of alcohol, the weight of grief pressing him into the furniture. I stood on your porch for 20 minutes. I could see you through the window, just sitting there, staring at nothing. He closed his eyes. I was about to knock, and then your mother came to the window. His blood went cold. She looked right at me. She didn't seem surprised. She just shook her head, slowly, like she was disappointed but not surprised. And then she walked away. Margaret paused. A minute later, you came to the window. Richard's throat closed. The memory surfaced now, murky, distorted. A woman on the porch, his mother's hand on his arm, her voice. It's no one, darling. Just someone looking for a handout. Close the curtain. You need to rest. I saw someone, he whispered. A woman, I thought. You thought what your mother told you to think. Margaret's voice was steady now, almost gentle. She came back into the room. I could see her talking to you. And then you looked at me. Really looked. For 5 seconds. Maybe 6. She paused. And then you closed the curtain. The silence stretched between them. Outside, a car passed on the street. Its headlights swept across the window and disappeared. Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. After that, Margaret said quietly, I stopped trying to reach you directly. I called a few more times. The last time, your mother answered. She told me if I ever came back, she would have me arrested for harassment. She said she had kept records of everything. The money transfer, my agreement to leave. She said she would tell everyone I had abandoned you. That I was a fraud. Richard couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. So I stopped. Her hands were still flat on the table. I stopped calling, stopped writing, stopped hoping. I came back here, to this house, the only place that still felt like home. And I raised our son, alone. He looked up at her. His eyes burned. 8 years, he whispered. 8 years, and I never. You could have known. Margaret's voice was quiet, not accusing, just tired, bone tired. The signs were there, the calls, the letter, the woman at your door. But you trusted your mother. You trusted her more than you trusted your own eyes. Richard's phone buzzed again. He pulled it out with shaking hands. The screen glowed in the darkness. Mom, calling. He stared at the name. His thumb hovered over the button. There's one more thing, Margaret said. He looked up. Her face was pale in the dim light, her eyes fixed on something far away. The day I came back, when Daniel was 1. Your mother didn't just tell you to close the curtain. Richard's blood went cold. What else did she say? Margaret met his eyes. She told you I was a ghost, a hallucination from the grief. She told you to go back to bed and forget what you saw. The phone kept buzzing in his hand. Mom, calling, and suddenly, everything he thought he knew about his life cracked down the middle. Richard answered the phone. Richard, darling, I've been trying to reach you. Where are you? You were supposed to meet me for dinner at... Did you do it? Silence on the other end. The grandfather clock in his mother's sitting room ticked faintly through the speaker. He knew that sound, had grown up with it. Richard, what are you talking about? You sound strange. Have you been drinking again? Did you tell me my wife was dead when she wasn't? The ticking continued. 1 second. 2, 3. Where are you? His mother's voice had changed, sharper now. The voice she used when dealing with difficult contractors or incompetent staff. Answer the question, Mother. I don't know what someone has been telling you, but Margaret told me. She's sitting right here, in the house you said was empty, the house you told me to sell. The ticking stopped, or maybe his mother had moved away from the clock. She's alive. The words came out flat, dead. 8 years, and she's been alive this whole time, living here, raising my son. Richard. His mother's voice shifted again, softer now, the voice she used when he was a child, when he'd scraped his knee or lost a baseball game. You need to come home. We can talk about this properly. Whatever that woman has told you. What woman? My wife, the mother of my child. She was never right for you. The words landed like a hammer blow. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. His knuckles went white. What did you say? I said she was never right for you. His mother's voice was calm, measured, as if she were discussing the stock market or a charity event. I saw the way she looked at other men, the way she dressed, the way she talked. She was using you, Richard, for your money, for your name. I was protecting you, protecting me. Yes, that's what mothers do. They protect their children from terrible mistakes. And marrying that girl was a mistake. You would have realized it eventually. A few years down the road, you would have come to me and said, Mother, you were right. But by then, there would have been lawyers, settlements, scandal. Richard's hand was shaking. The phone trembled against his ear. She was pregnant with my child. So she claimed. He has my eyes. Mother, the same shape, the same color, the same gold flecks. Silence. She could have. Don't. Richard's voice cracked. Don't you dare. I've seen him. I've looked into his face. He's mine. The clock started ticking again, or maybe it had never stopped. What proof did you have? Richard asked. When you told her to leave. When you paid her $50,000 to disappear. When you told me she died in a car accident that never happened. What proof did you have that she wasn't faithful? No answer. What proof? Mother, I didn't need proof. Eleanor Hayes's voice was ice. I knew. A mother always knows. I could see it in the way she moved through our house, like she didn't belong, like she was waiting for something better to come along. Richard's hands curled into fists. "You destroyed my life," he whispered. "Based on nothing. Based on a feeling. I saved your life. You just don't see it yet. That woman would have bled you dry. She would have taken everything and left you with nothing. I prevented that. I gave you 8 years of freedom. 8 years to build your career, I spent those 8 years drinking myself to death." The words hung in the air. "I spent those years unable to get out of bed, unable to work, unable to think straight. I lost my job, lost my friends, lost everything that mattered because I was grieving, because I thought the woman I loved had burned to death in a car crash." His mother didn't respond. "And the whole time she was alive, raising my son, in the house I bought for her." "The house you told me to sell because it was too painful to keep." Richard's head dropped. The phone pressed hard against his ear. "You came to the window," he said into the silence. "When she came back, when Daniel was 1 year old, she stood on the porch, and you saw her." "I don't remember that. You told me she was a hallucination. You told me I was seeing things. You told me to go back to bed and forget what I saw." "Richard, you were very unwell at that time. You were drinking heavily. You were imagining things. I was trying to help you. She was real, Mother. She was standing on my porch, trying to reach me, and you told me she was a ghost." The clock ticked. "I did what I thought was best." "Best for whom?" "For you. For the family. For our reputation. Do you have any idea what people would have said? Richard Hayes married to a waitress. Richard Hayes with a child out of wedlock. The gossip would have been unbearable." Richard laughed. The sound came out broken and sharp. "Reputation," he repeated. "You destroyed 3 lives for reputation. I protected our family. You protected yourself." His voice rose. "You protected your position, your precious dinner parties and charity galas. You didn't care about me. You cared about what people would say at the country club." "That's not true. Everything I did for you." "Then why didn't you tell me the truth? If you really believed she was no good for me, why didn't you come to me and say so? Why didn't you give me the choice?" Silence. "Because you knew," Richard continued. "You knew I would have chosen her. You knew I loved her, and you couldn't stand it. You couldn't stand the thought of sharing me with someone else." His mother's breath came through the speaker, shallow, quick. "I'm your mother." Her voice trembled now. "I've known you since before you were born. I changed your diapers. I held you when you cried. That woman knew you for 2 years. 2 years, and you would have chosen her over me." "Yes." Richard's voice was steady now. "Certain. I would have. Because that's what love means. It means building a life with someone. It means putting them first." "She didn't deserve that. And you did." The question hung between them. Richard looked at Margaret. She was crying now, silent tears running down her cheeks. She wasn't wiping them away. "I'm not coming to dinner," Richard said into the phone. "I'm not coming home. I don't know if I ever want to see you again." "Richard, wait." He ended the call. The phone slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. His hands shook so badly he couldn't control them. His shoulders hunched forward. His head dropped into his palms. For a long moment, he just sat there, breathing, trying to hold himself together. Margaret didn't move, didn't speak, didn't reach across the table, but she also didn't look away. "I'm sorry," Richard whispered. The words scraped against his throat. "I'm so sorry. You didn't know." "I should have." He looked up at her. "You called 17 times. You wrote a letter. You came to my door. You stood in front of me, and I—" His voice broke. "I closed the curtain." Margaret nodded slowly. "You did. Because I trusted her. My mother. I trusted her more than I trusted my own eyes." "Yes." Richard stared at his hands. The wedding ring still on his finger. He'd never taken it off. Not in 8 years. "I want to blame her," he said quietly. "I want to say this is all her fault. That she manipulated me. That I was just a victim." He looked up at Margaret. "But it's not that simple, is it?" Margaret's eyes met his, wet, tired, but steady. "No," she said softly. It's not. She unclasped her hands, laid them flat on the table. Your mother wasn't the only one who pushed me away. Richard's chest tightened. What do you mean? Margaret took a breath. The day at the park, when Daniel ran to you, I need to tell you what I saw. Margaret's hands were steady on the table. The day at the park wasn't the first time I tried to reach you, she said. You know that now, but I need you to understand what happened, what I saw. Richard nodded. His throat was too tight to speak. When Daniel was one, I'd been working double shifts for months, saving every penny. I'd found a lawyer who said he could help me pro bono because he believed my story. He told me I needed to confront you directly, face to face. No more phone calls your mother could intercept. She paused, drew a breath. So I drove all night, left Daniel with a neighbor I trusted. I didn't bring him because I didn't know what I'd find. I didn't know if you'd even open the door. Richard's hands gripped the edge of the table. I got there around 7 in the morning. Your car was in the driveway. The curtains were closed. I sat in my car for almost an hour, trying to work up the courage. She looked down at her hands. Finally, I walked up to the porch. I could see movement through the window. Someone was awake. I raised my hand to knock. She stopped. And then I saw her, your mother. She was standing in the hallway, looking right at me through the gap in the curtains. Richard's blood went cold. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look angry. She just watched me, like I was something she'd been expecting, something she'd prepared for. Margaret's voice dropped. She shook her head, slowly, back and forth, and then she walked away from the window. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. A minute later, you appeared. Richard's heart stopped. You came to the window. You pulled back the curtain, and you looked at me. The memory surfaced now, not murky, not distant, clear as glass. A woman on the porch, thin, tired, hair longer than he remembered, eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in months. His mother's hand on his arm, her voice in his ear. It's no one, darling, just someone looking for money. Probably saw your name in the paper and thought she could get something out of you. Closed the curtain. And he had looked at that woman, looked right at her, and felt something stir in his chest, something that whispered, that's her. That's Margaret. She's alive. But he had pushed it down, because believing it would have meant his mother had lied, because believing it would have meant 8 months of grief had been for nothing, because believing it would have meant he'd have to feel again, to live again, to face the world without the comfortable numbness of alcohol and self-pity. So, he had looked at his wife, his living, breathing wife, and chosen to believe she was a stranger. He had closed the curtain. I remember, Richard whispered. The words came out broken, jagged. I remember now. Margaret nodded slowly. I know you do. I saw you. I saw your face. And his voice cracked. I told myself it wasn't you. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself, your mother told you what to think. Margaret's voice was gentle, almost kind. And you believed her? No. Richard shook his head. His hands were trembling. No, that's not the whole truth. He looked up at her. His eyes were wet. I knew, somewhere inside me, I knew it was you. I felt it. When I looked through that window, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Something that scared me. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Hope. The word hung in the air between them, and I couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle the possibility that you were alive, because if you were alive, then everything I'd been doing for 8 months, the drinking, the sleeping, the giving up, all of it was pointless. All of it was just me hiding from the truth. Richard's head dropped into his hands. So, I let myself believe my mother. I let her tell me you were a hallucination, a ghost. And I closed the curtain and went back to bed and poured myself another drink. His shoulders began to shake. I chose the bottle over you. I chose numbness over hope. I chose my mother's lies over my own eyes. Margaret didn't speak. Richard pushed back from the table. His legs were unsteady as he stood. The room tilted around him. I need air. He stumbled toward the back door. His hand fumbled with the latch. He pushed it open and stepped out onto the small wooden porch. The night air hit his face, cold, sharp, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. He made it 3 steps before his legs gave out. His knees hit the damp grass. Then his hands. The ground was wet from an earlier rain, and mud seeped through his expensive trousers, soaked into his palms. He didn't care. He knelt there in the darkness, in the mud, in the wreckage of everything he thought he was. Richard Hayes, millionaire, successful businessman, respected member of society. A man who had looked at his own wife through a window and chosen to believe she was dead. A man who had passed his own son on a park bench and said, "Sorry, kid, wrong person." A man who had spent 8 years mourning a ghost while the real woman raised his child alone, 10 miles away, in the house he owned. The mud soaked through to his knees. His hands sank into the soft earth. He could smell it, the rich, dark scent of soil and rain and rot. This was where he belonged. Not in boardrooms, not in country clubs, not in his mother's parlor with its grandfather clock and its silver tea service. Here, in the mud, in the dark, alone with the truth of what he'd done. His stomach heaved. He doubled over, retching into the grass. Nothing came up but bile and shame. Behind him, the screen door creaked open, Margaret's footsteps on the porch. Then silence. She didn't come to him, didn't offer comfort, didn't tell him it would be all right. She just stood there, watching him kneel in the mud like a penitent before an altar he didn't deserve to approach. "I did this," Richard gasped between heaves. "Not just my mother. Me. I did this." "Yes." Margaret's voice was quiet, steady. "You did. I saw you. I saw you, and I closed the curtain." "Yes. I could have opened the door. I could have—" His voice broke completely. He pressed his forehead against the wet grass, not caring about the mud smearing across his face, his hair, his $1,000 suit. "I threw away everything," he whispered into the earth. "Everything that mattered. And I told myself it was grief. I told myself I was a victim. But I wasn't." He lifted his head. Mud dripped from his chin. "I was a coward." Margaret stood at the edge of the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. The light from the kitchen silhouetted her figure. "There's one more thing you need to know," she said quietly. Richard looked up at her. His face was streaked with mud and tears. "The day at the park, when Daniel ran to you—" Her voice caught. "That wasn't an accident either." Richard's breath stopped. "I brought him there, on purpose. I'd been watching you for months, learning your routine. I knew you went to that bench every Tuesday and Thursday." She stepped off the porch. 1 step. 2. Until she was standing at the edge of the grass, looking down at the broken man kneeling in the mud. "I brought our son to you, Richard. I stood across the path and watched him run to his father. I thought maybe if you saw him, something would click. Something would wake up inside you." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But you looked at your own son. You looked into his eyes, your eyes, and you said no." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He stayed on his knees in the mud, his hands sinking deeper into the wet earth. The cold seeped through his clothes, into his skin, into his bones, but it was nothing compared to the cold spreading through his chest. "I watched him run across the grass," Margaret continued. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor underneath. "His little legs moving so fast. His shoes were untied. I'd meant to tie them before we left, but I forgot. I was too nervous." Richard couldn't speak, couldn't move. "He stopped right in front of you. You looked up from the bench. You saw him." The memory surfaced now, not murky, not distant, sharp and clear as broken glass. A small face, dark hair, eyes that seemed too old for such a young body. A voice, high and hopeful. "Are you my dad?" And Richard had looked at that face, really looked, and felt something stir in his chest. Something that whispered, "Those eyes. Those are your eyes. That's your jaw. That's your father's nose." But he had pushed it down, because believing would have meant questioning, and questioning would have meant feeling, and feeling would have meant facing the truth he'd buried under 8 years of alcohol and self-pity. "You looked at him for a long time," Margaret said. "Maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10. I was watching from across the path, holding my breath. I really thought something would click." Richard's shoulders shook. "And then you stood up. You said something to him I couldn't hear what? And you walked away." "Sorry, kid. Wrong person." The words came out of Richard's mouth without him meaning to say them. The exact words he'd spoken 3 years ago. The words that had sent his own son running back to his mother with tears streaming down his face. "He cried the whole way home," Margaret said quietly. "He kept asking what he did wrong, why the man in the picture didn't want him." Richard's forehead pressed against the wet grass. The smell of mud and earth filled his nostrils. His stomach heaved again, but there was nothing left to come up. "I didn't know what to tell him. I held him and said it wasn't his fault, but I could see he didn't believe me. I knew." Richard's voice came out as a rasp, barely human. "I knew it was him. When I looked at his face, I knew. I saw my eyes looking back at me. I saw—" His voice cracked. "I saw everything I'd been running from for 5 years. He lifted his head. Mud dripped from his forehead, his chin, his nose. "And I ran. Again. I looked at my own son and I ran away because seeing him would have meant I couldn't hide anymore." Margaret stood at the edge of the grass, her arms wrapped around herself. She didn't speak. "My mother lied to me," Richard continued, his voice breaking. "She manipulated me. She destroyed our family. But she didn't make me walk away from Daniel at the park. She didn't make me close the curtain when you stood on my porch. She didn't make me delete your voicemails without listening to them." He pressed his muddy palms against his face. "I did those things. I chose those things. Because choosing to see the truth would have been harder than choosing to be blind." The back door creaked. Small footsteps on the wooden porch. Richard's hands dropped from his face. Daniel stood in the doorway, his star-patterned pajamas bright against the dark kitchen behind him. His feet were bare. His hair was mussed from lying in bed. He was looking at Richard, at the man kneeling in the mud, covered in dirt, face streaked with tears and soil. "I heard crying," Daniel said. His voice was small, uncertain. "I thought maybe Mom was—" He trailed off. Richard stared at his son, at the child he had rejected not once, but twice, 3 times. If he counted the curtain, 4 times. If he counted the voicemails, 5, 6, 7 times. If he counted all the years he'd chosen not to look, not to question, not to hope. The boy looked back at him. Those eyes, brown with gold flecks. The same eyes Richard saw in the mirror every morning. The same eyes that had looked at him from across a park bench 3 years ago, full of hope and confusion and desperate longing. And Richard had killed that hope with 2 words. "I'm sorry." The words came out broken, pathetic, nowhere near enough. "I'm sorry I didn't see you. I'm sorry I walked away. I'm sorry I—" His voice gave out completely. Daniel didn't move. He stood on the porch, his small hands gripping the railing, watching his father fall apart in the mud below. The silence stretched. The refrigerator hummed inside the house. A car passed on the distant road. An owl called somewhere in the trees. Then Daniel stepped off the porch. 1 step down, then another. His bare feet touched the wet grass. He walked toward Richard slowly, carefully, like he was approaching a wounded animal he wasn't sure would bite. He stopped 3 feet away. "I was really mad at you," he said. His voice wavered, cracked, sounded like what it was a 7-year-old trying to hold together something too heavy for his small shoulders. "After the park, I was really, really mad. I didn't understand why you said no." Richard's chest ached. "But then I got older, and Mom explained some things." Daniel looked down at his bare feet in the wet grass. "She said sometimes people are scared, and scared people do dumb things." He looked up again. His eyes met Richard's. "She said that doesn't make it okay. Being scared doesn't make it okay to hurt people." His voice dropped. "But she said understanding why someone did something is different from forgiving them." Richard's throat closed. The boy was 7 years old. 7. And he was speaking with more wisdom than Richard had shown in 52 years of living. Daniel's voice trembled. He rubbed his nose with the back of his hand. "I just wanted to know one thing." He took one more step forward, close enough now that Richard could see the tear tracks on his cheeks. the slight tremble in his lower lip. "Do you see me now?" The question hit Richard harder than anything else that night. Not "do you love me?" Not "do you want to be my father?" Not "will you stay?" Just "do you see me?" The most basic question a child could ask. The most fundamental human need. To be seen. To be acknowledged. To exist in someone else's eyes. Richard looked at his son. Really looked. Took in every detail. The scar on his chin. The way his hair curled at the temples. The small gap between his front teeth. The way he stood with his feet turned slightly inward, the same way Richard had stood as a child. "Yes," Richard whispered. His voice was raw, wrecked. "I see you. I see you now." Daniel's expression didn't change. He didn't smile, didn't cry, didn't run into Richard's arms. He just stood there, watching, evaluating, deciding. "Will you?" Richard's voice trembled. "Will you give me a chance to be better? To be what I should have been?" Daniel glanced at his mother. Margaret stood at the edge of the porch, her face unreadable in the darkness. Then he looked back at Richard. "Mom said you'd ask that." His voice was steadier now. "She said if you ever came back, you'd ask for a chance." Richard held his breath. "She said to let you show us first." Richard pushed himself up from the mud. His knees ached. His hands were caked with dirt. His suit, the $1,000 suit he'd worn to impress the real estate agent, was ruined beyond saving. He didn't care. He looked at Daniel, at the small boy standing barefoot in the wet grass, waiting for an answer to a question that shouldn't have needed asking. "Do you see me now?" Richard walked toward his son. Slowly, deliberately. When he was 3 feet away, he lowered himself to one knee, bringing his eyes level with Daniel's. The grass was cold and wet beneath his kneecap. Mud soaked through what was left of his trousers. He didn't flinch. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. His voice was quiet, steady, the steadiest it had been all night. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. I'm not asking for that." Daniel watched him, silent, waiting. "I'm asking for something smaller, something I have to earn." Richard reached for the watch on his wrist. The silver band caught the faint light from the kitchen window. He unclasped it slowly, feeling the familiar weight leave his skin for the first time in 15 years. "This was my father's," he said. "He gave it to me the day I proposed to your mother. He told me it was a reminder that time keeps moving whether we're ready or not, that every second is a choice." He held the watch out to Daniel. "I made bad choices. For years, I chose not to see. I chose not to listen. I chose not to believe. And those choices hurt you, hurt your mother, hurt everyone." Daniel looked at the watch, but didn't take it. "I can't undo those choices," Richard continued. "I can't go back to that bench at the park and say yes instead of no. I can't open the curtain instead of closing it. I can't answer those phone calls I ignored." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "But I can make different choices now, starting tonight, starting with this." He pressed the watch into Daniel's small hands. The boy's fingers closed around the metal instinctively. "Keep this," Richard said. "So you know I'm coming back for it." Daniel looked down at the watch, then up at Richard, then at his mother. Margaret stood at the edge of the porch, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Her face was unreadable in the darkness. "You're leaving." Daniel's voice was small. "Tonight." "Yes." Richard stood up slowly. His knee protested he was too old to be kneeling on wet ground. "But I'll be back. Tomorrow. And the day after. And every day after that. Until you believe me. Why can't you stay now?" The question was so simple, so direct, the way only a child could ask. Richard looked at Margaret. She gave a tiny nod. "Because I need to do something first," he said. "Something I should have done a long time ago. I need to face your grandmother. I need to tell her that what she did was wrong, that I know the truth now, and that I won't let her control my life anymore." Daniel's grip tightened on the watch. "And because your mother and I need time," Richard added. "Time to talk, time to figure out what happens next. I hurt her too, Daniel, maybe even more than I hurt you. I need to prove to both of you that I've changed, not with words, with actions." The backyard fell silent. The first hints of gray were appearing on the horizon. Dawn was coming. Richard could see it through the trees, the slow lightening of the sky, the gradual retreat of darkness. "How will I know you're really coming back?" Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. Richard walked back to his son. This time, he didn't kneel. He crouched down, putting one muddy hand on Daniel's shoulder. The boy didn't flinch, didn't pull away. "Because you have my father's watch," Richard said. "That watch means more to me than anything I own. I wouldn't leave it with someone I plan to abandon." Daniel looked down at the watch in his hands. His thumb traced the scratched crystal, the faded numbers, the small crown on the side. "It's heavy," he said quietly. "Yes." Richard's voice was thick. "Heavy things usually are." He stood up, looked at Margaret. She hadn't moved from the porch. Her arms were still wrapped around herself, but something in her expression had shifted. Not forgiveness, he hadn't earned that, but something else. Recognition, maybe, or the first fragile seed of possibility. "I'll be back tomorrow," Richard said. "If you'll let me." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Show us," she said finally. "That's all I ask. Show us." Richard nodded. He turned toward the house, walking through the back door, through the kitchen with its burnt smell and crayon drawings, through the hallway with its small red coat on the hook. The walk to the front door felt different now. The same house, the same furniture, but everything had changed. He reached the front door, paused, turned back. Daniel had followed him inside, the watch clutched in both hands. Margaret stood behind him, one hand resting on his shoulder, two silhouettes against the dim light of the kitchen. His family, the family he had thrown away, the family he had denied, the family he had failed in every possible way, but also the family that was still here, still standing, still willing to give him one more chance. "I'll see you tomorrow," Richard said. Daniel nodded, just once. A small, careful movement. Richard opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was cool against his face. The sky was shifting from gray to pink, the first light spreading across the horizon. Somewhere down the street, a bird began to sing. He walked to his car. His footsteps crunched on the gravel driveway, the same driveway where he'd parked 8 years ago, on the day he'd carried Margaret across the threshold of this house. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine. The dashboard clock read 5:47 a.m. Through the windshield, he could see the house, the white curtains in the window, the flowers in the window box, the red door that someone had painted fresh. 2 figures appeared at the window now, a woman and a child, watching him. Richard raised his hand, a small wave, an acknowledgement. After a moment, Daniel raised his hand too. The watch glinted on his wrist, too big for him, the band loose around his small arm. But there, Richard put the car in reverse, backed out of the driveway. The house grew smaller in his rearview mirror as he drove away. The 2 figures in the window shrank to specks, then disappeared. But the road ahead was lighter than the one behind. He would come back, tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that, not to sell the house, not to close a chapter, but to build something new, something real, something he had to earn, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one brick at a time. This story may have left something heavy in your chest, something that doesn't quite have a name. That's all right. Some feelings aren't meant to be named, only felt. Many of us have stood at a door we didn't open. Many of us have looked at someone we loved and turned away, not because we didn't care, but because we were afraid of what caring would cost. Some of us have been the one waiting on the other side of that door, wondering if we would ever be seen. Perhaps you've carried something like this for years. A call you didn't make, a word you didn't say, a moment when you could have reached out but didn't. These things live quietly inside us. They don't need to be fixed tonight. They don't need to be resolved. They're allowed to simply rest. Not everything broken gets mended. Not every story ends with forgiveness. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone turns around, someone comes back, and that possibility, however small, is enough to hold on to. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening.